So, and then Parley would go on short-term missions, as was often the case in that first decade, is when you heard the gospel, of course your immediate concern was to take the message to your loved ones, particularly your wife or your brothers or sisters. And of course that's what Parley did, of course, eventually baptizing his own brother and at least introducing the gospel to members of his family who, in time, many of them came into the church. But also then expanding your sort of circle of concern to broader members of the family, distant relatives, cousins, nephews, nieces. And so for much of the first 6-7 years anyway of Mormonism, so much of the missionary work is done sort of family to family, really. And that's the early section of the Doctrine and Covenants tend to be to individuals, just giving them directions on what to do and where to go. Gradually, of course, as the church grew, there had to be more direction. You have to introduce a licensing system so that you're not unauthorized when you represent the church. And then eventually sort of missionary journeys by compass direction. You should go to the east, or you should go to the south, or the west. And then finally, particularly after the Quorum of the 12 is called, in the first Quorum of 70s in 1835, you begin to get more specific direction and sort of bureaucratic control of more missionary work. But even then, what's interesting is Parley, of course, and Orson are called to be apostles in 1835. But an apostle in 1835 had no authority except outside of organized stakes. In other words, they could not go in and tell a stake president what to do. And that's why if you follow their missions, and particularly from 35 to when they returned from their British missions in 1841-42, all of their assignments are in the mission field, literally outside of where the church is organized. But once they've had that marvelous experience in the British Isles, where for the first time under Brigham Young's direction, they can't run next door and have Joseph Smith answer their question. They can't, they have to get on their knees, they have to make decisions, they have to counsel among themselves, they have to be humble. And so the Quorum begins to pull together as a unit. When they return to Nauvoo, Joseph sees that tremendous growth in the Quorum of the 12 in just the 6 years or so since the first apostles had been called. And then he begins to really unload the kingdom on the Quorum of the 12. They become the first, they're put in charge of immigration, they're put in charge of church publications. There's actually a revelation we now have in January of 1842 giving the Quorum of the 12 responsibility for church publications. They have responsibility for the scriptures, they have responsibility for finances, for raising money for the temple. I think 9 of the 12 are on the Nauvoo City Council. So they just are involved in everything next to the prophet Joseph, so that when he's killed in 44, June of 44, in their mind there's no question who has been working and leading the kingdom, even though there's no public announcement really, but for those who were close to the scene, they all knew who the rightful possessors of the keys to the kingdom were. But of course that put increased responsibility on the 12, and of course Brigham Young as president of the Quorum of the 12 continued to give assignments, and that's when these men then begin to spread out, as Orson and Parley both had done, short-term and longer-term missions. They're getting experience, they're learning how to stand on their own 2 feet. You have to remember that first generation is awful young. I mean, these men are in their early 20s. You can imagine doing all that they did, not just the writing, but the preaching. These are men who are usually just, most of them anyway, from a background they're not well educated, they're self-taught, they're bright, capable individuals, but they've got to learn how to do this. And so Parley would then undertake missions both, once the Quorum of the 12 consolidated its authority after Joseph Smith's death, then Brigham Young uses the 12 pretty much as geographical leaders. And he does that in both Europe and in America, so that Parley tends to get assignments. And of course, you have to remember too that they're in the middle of immigration and colonization, and so he has to use the 12 as leaders in that. So these men aren't just doing missions for proselyting, they're doing missions for colonization and exploring. So Parley's trip to southern Utah in 1849 would be the first major Mormon exploration south of the Salt Lake Valley down to the St. George area. And Parley led that. It's one of those lesser known things, but it's a very important thing where these men's leadership and their directions would, and the things they learned from those things would be used for decades as the church would later plant colonies in the areas where they sent these men out to see where the water was, where minerals were, where animal life and grass and so forth was. So that's a mission, but not in a technical sense in Mormon history.